Last week, Reverend Black shared with you some thoughts on Joseph as a young man. And today, I'm going to be sharing some thoughts on the middle section of Joseph's life from the time he was 17 years old until he was 37 years old. And this is a continuation of the story, and I would invite you, not now during the sermon, but at another time, to go back and read this narrative between chapters 37 and 45 in Genesis. These years, the years that Joseph was 17 to 37, were very significant. Joseph, you'll remember, was one of Jacob's 12 sons. Jacob is also known as Israel, one of the 12 sons of Israel that formed the 12 tribes of Israel. And this period in Joseph's life was a series of ups and downs. He was exalted and he was laid low over and over again. At age 17, using the good judgment of a 17-year-old, he shared with his brothers a dream that he had had about how they would all eventually bow down to him. He was Dad's favorite. His father had given him a special robe with long sleeves. You may have heard the musical Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. It's based on Joseph's robe. His brothers didn't like that very much, and so they put him in a pit. And while some of them wanted to kill him, others thought that wouldn't be a good idea. So when some traders came by, they pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him into slavery to these traders who were going down to Egypt. Joseph gets to Egypt, a very young man, 17 years old. He's sold into slavery. He's sold to a man named Potiphar. But he's so efficient, he's so skillful that he rises in Potiphar's household until he becomes the household manager, and all of Potiphar's worldly business is placed in Joseph's hand. And so things are looking up for Joseph. But Potiphar's wife has an eye for Joseph. It says in the text that he was a handsome young man, and she makes advances toward him. And when he refuses her, she trumps up charges against him, claiming that he has made advances to her. And so Potiphar has him placed in prison. In prison, his gifts and skills are recognized by the keeper of the prison, and he's placed in charge of all the prisoners. And in the prison, there are two prisoners. One is Pharaoh's baker. The other is Pharaoh's butler. And they've been in prison because Pharaoh got upset with them. They had dreams too, dreams that were upsetting them. They couldn't figure out the meaning of them. And Joseph, as we've learned, was an interpreter of dreams. He explained to them the meaning of their dreams. To the butler, he announced, "You will be restored to your post." And to the baker, he says, "The interpretation of your dream is that Pharaoh will have you hung." And that's exactly what happened. But when the butler was restored, he forgot all about it. Years passed, and then Pharaoh began to have dreams too. And they were troubling dreams. Pharaoh dreamed that out of the Nile River came 7 fat, well-fed cattle, and they were followed out of the Nile by 7 ugly and lean cattle who gobbled them up and still looked ugly and lean. And he had a second dream that there were stalks of grain, and 7 stalks of grain had much fruit on them, and 7 stalks that were sickly consumed the 7 that were good. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't interpret Pharaoh's dream. But the butler remembered Joseph. And so Joseph was brought to Pharaoh, and he correctly interpreted the dream to Pharaoh. He said, "What the dream means is this. There are going to be 7 years of plenty in the land, and there'll be abundant crops, and that will be followed by 7 years of terrible famine. Joseph says to Pharaoh, if I were you, I'd find somebody who could prepare for the famine during the fat years. Now, Pharaoh recognized Joseph's virtues and placed him in charge of the whole country at age 30. At age 30, Joseph, who had been down in the pit that his brothers had placed him in, had been raised up and sold into slavery down into Egypt, had been raised up in Potiphar's house and then thrown into the prison, was now raised up and made the ruler of all of Egypt at age 30. And it happened exactly as the dream predicted. There were 7 bountiful years of harvests, and during this time, Joseph collected 20% of all of the harvest and stored it in the cities so that they would be ready for the time of famine. And the 7 good years were followed by the famine. Now, the famine was severe, and people came to Joseph to buy grain. And the famine wasn't just localized, it was a regional famine. And so Jacob, back there in Canaan, hears that there is food in Egypt. He sends his sons, he sends 10 of his sons down to Egypt to get some food for the family. And when they come to Egypt and they come into Joseph's presence, he recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. He gives them food, but accuses them of being spies. And he takes one of them as a hostage and says, you can prove to me you're not spies if you bring back that youngest brother you told me about, a brother named Benjamin, who was loved by his father and had remained in Canaan. The famine continues, and the folks in Canaan are desperate enough that they send the brothers back along with Benjamin. And Joseph sees that they get food, and after a little bit more trickery that I'll allow you to read about on your own time, they are brought back into Joseph's presence where he reveals to them who he is. And that's our scripture for this morning. It begins on page 52, Genesis 45, beginning at verse 1. Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, send everyone away from me. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come closer to me. They came closer, and he said, I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry up and go to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. In the Pew Bible, this section of the narrative has a title. It says, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. But something else gets revealed here. The light bulb goes off in Joseph's head. Actually, the light bulb wasn't to be invented for many years. But he had a sudden realization about his life. The meaning of his life was revealed to him at this moment. He reappraised everything that had happened to him from age 17 to that point, all the difficulties he'd gone through, all the ways he'd been raised up and cast down. And this is what he says. Let me share these two verses with you again. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. The lives of biblical characters find their purpose related to God's will and God's intent. This is true of Joseph, but it's also true of Moses and the prophets, of Esther. Remember the phrase in Esther 4, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And in the New Testament, Paul or Mary, Jesus' mother, they find their meaning and their purpose in God's will and God's intent. And so I have a very simple question to ask you this morning. How is it that you interpret your life? How is it that you interpret your life? Do you see your life as simply a random set of events? Do you, along with Shakespeare's Macbeth, say, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. I had to memorize that in high school. Did you? Do you see your life as simply a random series of events that signify nothing, have no meaning, have no purpose, just random events? Or maybe you see your life as related to being lucky or unlucky. If you do, you should remember that the ancient pagans had a pagan god named Fortuna, the god of luck. Do you see your life as a series of random events or simply as a matter of being lucky or unlucky? Or maybe if you don't see your life as random or lucky, maybe you think about fate. You think life is fated. Daniel Defoe said this, "The best of men cannot suspend their fate. The good die early and the bad die late." People who believe in fate see life as if it is a Greek tragedy. There's an evil end that awaits, and we can't do anything to stop it. I have a friend who served in combat in Vietnam, and he once told me that in combat it's very hard not to believe in fate because of all the chaos that goes on around you. It's hard to make any sense out of who lives and who dies. Fate is seen as an impersonal force and usually for ill. Are these the way that you see your life? Or do you see your life as Joseph did when he had that moment of reflection? He saw there was a huge difference between random events and the providence of God. Now, the providence of God is very different than fate. providence of God, that word providence, has as its root the same word that our word provide has. God provides for us in our lives. God's purpose is somehow evident in Joseph's life. Do you see God's purpose as evident in your life? As we close our service later today, we're going to sing "He Leadeth Me," which is a hymn about this kind of understanding of life. John Wesley understood this. He talked about the grace of God, the providence of God active in our lives before we even recognize it. He called it prevenient grace. And that's why in our church we baptize infants. They can't understand what's happening, but even though they can't understand, they can't even see one piece of the 1,200-piece puzzle. We know that God's active in their lives and God's providence is working with them. Do you see God's purpose in your life? Or do you only see one little piece of the puzzle and you can't see the whole picture? Now, few of us probably have as the purpose of our life to save the kingdom or save the nation, but there are purposes in our life that are very important to our unique personhood. Some people are teachers, and who knows the impact of that teaching on the lives of others. And some people are engaged in raising children. You know, I wonder if Abraham Lincoln's mother had any idea when he was a toddler of the person she was training. There are larger purposes in our lives. We have unexpected encounters with strangers and people at work and people about town every single day. And they are contexts that have meaning. One of my favorite movies ever is Jimmy Stewart and It's a Wonderful Life. And the reason I love that movie is that it emphasizes the connection we have to each other and the way that we influence each other and our lives fit into a pattern of meaning. This morning, I want you to think about Joseph's life and the moment when it dawned on him that all those little pieces fit together in a much bigger picture. And review your own life and think about how you can see a larger picture. See something of God's hand and God's grace running out ahead of you and providing for you. And remember the words of the hymn we will sing. He leadeth me, O blessed thought, O words with heavenly comfort fraught. Whatever I do, wherever I be, still 'tis God's hand that leadeth me. Do you see a larger picture in your life? Amen.